In the last video, which was technically on the ninth commandment, you shall not covet your neighbor's wife, I spent a good amount of time speaking about modesty and didn't necessarily talk about coveting. But here we are in the 10th commandment. You shall not covet your neighbor's goods. And this is an opportunity for us to review this reality of what it is to covet, as well as to consider the realities of the sins of envy and greed. So let's take a look. In this 10th commandment, you shall not covet your neighbor's goods, we want to speak especially about greed and of envy. And it is here that the word covet is more meaningful, because with the ninth commandment, certainly, you shall not covet your neighbor's wife, it does apply, obviously, or it wouldn't be there. But when we think of the meaning of this word, which is to want to acquire unjustly that which is of another, the truth is, to covet is far more likely within this context of the 10th commandment, when we think of, again, these two sins of greed and of envy, where in the ninth commandment, it manifests itself as lust, and of course, as we treated last time, the importance of being modest in our own presenting of self and our own viewing of others. Here, with the 10th commandment, it is more directly that coveting takes place when we seek possessions of another and try to obtain them in an unjust manner, or where we have, again, this disposition in our heart that wants to acquire and amass things, or that is jealous and envious of what another may have, and thus we turn our hearts against them. And so to covet, we want to be very clear here. It's a sin in its own right, but it is also one that can lead to greater sins. Let's take, for example, the sin of greed. Greed, of course, manifests itself beginning in our heart. We want, we desire, and certainly there are legitimate needs we all have. We have need for food, we have need for right clothing, or a place to live, and realities that are legitimate. But to want to take and to hoard or to keep for oneself as though our security is in these things, this is a problem. And very often, greed leads to other kinds of sins, where we begin to take advantage of others or close our hearts to their needs when we can legitimately assist them. And this is something that it builds. It continues to grow even more sinister, possibly, when we start to, say, cheat others in business dealings because this greed has taken such deep hold of us. And so it is one of these slippery slope kinds of capital sins as we think of greed, where it might start out as just a small little disordered spark or desire in our heart for more than what we really need, but then it becomes something that causes us to hurt others and even hurt ourselves. Envy is very similar in that regard. When we envy another, what they have, what they possess, who they are, characteristics about their very being, it can lead us to want to treat them in an unjust and uncharitable manner. It can lead us to want to harm them, whether by word or by deed. And so once again, one of these slippery slopes, and all of it is rooted in this unjust desire for what is of another. And so we need to be very clear that this commandment, like the ninth, when it uses this word covet, while it's speaking of a very specific type of disposition within our heart, how it opens us up to many greater sins if we are not watchful and careful. And to that end, quite beautifully, the Catechism, in its very short section on the 10th commandment, also speaks of the realities of poverty of heart and how we are invited to practice trusting in the Lord, trusting in his divine providence. You might remember the passage from the Sermon on the Mount where Jesus, towards the end of that sermon, he begins to speak about, do not worry about tomorrow, because today has enough of its own. And, we, for our part, should trust that the Lord will provide for us, that if we seek first his kingdom, everything else that we truly need will be added onto us. And he uses the images of nature. Look at the birds of the sky. They have all that they need. Or look at the flowers of the field. They don't cause any of their own growth, but yet they have such beautiful splendor because of how God made them and provides for them. So it is with we who are by far his greatest love, having been made in his image and likeness. If he does all of these things for the irrational creatures, how much more will he do it for you and I, whom he loved him onto giving himself up in death? And to that end, it's important for us to prayerfully consider this commandment from that point of view of learning to trust in God, learning to let him be our true fulfillment. Because it is here, and again, in this context of greed, in this context of envy, how often it is that people get sucked into a mentality in this life that their fulfillment is in a creature or in a certain group of creatures, let's call it, or in our own human institutions. People seek fulfillment in other people. People will seek fulfillment in achievement. Tom Brady, Super Bowl champion quarterback, however many times over. I don't even remember anymore. He's won it so many times, it seems. He's still not satisfied, and he said as much in an interview a few years ago. Why? Because none of these earthly realities truly sustain us or truly give us fulfillment, even if they can make us happy for a little while. They do not fill that longing in our heart for what sustains us and truly gives us completion. And what is that? Or better said, who is that? It is God. It is Jesus Christ. He is our true fulfillment. And so things like greed and envy, they go totally against the very way that God truly desires to fulfill us and promises to fulfill us. Because we think by our own attaining and acquiring that we're going to have something, when really it's our letting go and letting God. And this is one of the beautiful paradoxes of our Catholic faith. Jesus says elsewhere, if you truly want to live, you must deny yourself and take up your cross and follow me, because the one who seeks to preserve his life will lose it, but the one who loses his life for my sake and that of the gospel will find it. When we give ourselves over, and I'm not going to say this is easy. We are all very much on this journey. It is one of the reasons why we are called to pray every day, to let Jesus into our hearts, to let him truly take hold of us and draw us closer to himself, and to learn to ask him for this very fulfillment, to help us to let go of anything that weighs us down, to help us to see in the creatures of the world, yes, the beautiful creatures that they are as he himself made them, but not our be-all and end-all. But rather, we are all called to glorify God, and that his glory is shown through creation. We rejoice in that, but it is not his creation, nor anything in it that comes about by our own human ingenuity and craftsmanship that brings us fulfillment. God alone is our source of fulfillment. And so when we consider this realm of the 10th commandment, you shall not covet your neighbor's good, to always remember that desires within our heart are very natural and real, and we have a desire written within us for God and for completion. But when that desire becomes twisted or disordered in such a way where we begin to desire worldly things, even in this context, our neighbor's goods, or going back to the 9th commandment, our neighbor's spouse, when we begin to desire that way, It's a disorder that can lead to far greater sins. And so we want to be very real and to rely upon the grace of God, because it is here, and soon enough we will be entering into the sacraments, these sources of God's grace. We want to rely upon Him to help us, to learn to see that our true life, our fulfillment is to be found in Him, and when we fully open ourselves to Him, we will lack nothing. He will give us everything that we ever desired, He Himself. May God bless you.